these days, we certainly know from the report that you did that Medicare does, and for the last several years, will actually prevent an injured worker from having Medicare pay for a procedure or something necessary if the MSA was not accurately used and the money in it was used only for medical expenses related to the work injury. So now it's a reality.
Welcome to another episode of It's Settled, the Amitros podcast, where you'll hear authentic stories of overcoming adversity after a life-changing injury and how injury survivors, members, and industry experts are making a difference. I'm Andrea Mills, Chief Client Officer at Amitros.
And I'm John Kane, Senior Vice President of Strategy. If today's episode inspires you, please subscribe and leave a review to help inspire more listeners facing similar situations. Now, it's settled. Let's get on to the episode and explore the human side of workers' comp and insurance claims.
So today we're so excited to have Gregg Chapman with the National Settlement Consultants. And Gregg's going to chat with us about Medicare and, things he's done in the industry. And we're so excited to have him. Welcome, Gregg.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Awesome. So we love to start off our podcast with just understanding how people get involved in workers' comp or the insurance industry, because I don't think in fifth grade when we're picking our future jobs, we're like, you know what, that's what I'm going to do. So we would love to hear from you, how did you get involved in this lovely industry that we're in that, we've seemed to find ourselves in and made really great careers out of?
Oh, I'd be happy to. Well, I first got involved with MSAs and workers' compensation structured settlements back in 2002, which was just a few months after that original Patel memorandum from CMS came out in July 2001 that for the first time mentioned Medicare set-aside arrangements. My brother Steve, who had been involved in work comp structured settlements for years, introduced me to one of the very first MSA vendors who was looking to expand to the West Coast. So I joined them, and that was a very great learning experience, and was with them for about a year when a new MSA vendor contacted me and wanted to bring me on board because they had just signed a deal with CMS to have somebody go across the country with the CMS representative explaining what Medicare set-asides were. And they were looking for an attorney, so that worked out great for both of us. So I started a bunch of different presentations. We went from the West Coast to the East Coast. The CMS representative would give his presentation, and we were presenting to insurers and attorneys and claims examiners what the MSA was. So he would go first, give his explanation of what the MSA was and how it fit in to the settlement, and then I would go as a representative of an MSA vendor explaining how we could help meet the requirements that CMS has set up. So that was great. And then over the next 6 years, I worked for different MSA vendors in a number of capacities, including general counsel and in marketing. And then in 2009, I hooked up with my brother Steve and started doing structured settlements, which is what I'm still doing today.
That's awesome. I love that you get to work with your brother. That must be a lot of fun.
It is.
And also just to orient everyone of our listeners, you are based in California and the injured worker in California is called an applicant. And, different words are used throughout the country, but I think, moving forward through the rest of this podcast, we'll refer to the injured party as applicant, just to keep in line with the vernacular that's used out in California. And so, I'd love to hear a little bit from you, how you work through and assist your clients or the applicant in negotiating their settlements.
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. As the name of our company implies, National Settlement Consultants, it's our job to help both sides, come to a negotiated settlement. And our role as structured settlement brokers is unique in the sense that we can provide the present value costs of both the indemnity value and the future medical costs when both parties are looking to settle the case. Now, it's easy for defense attorneys and applicant attorneys and the claims examiners to figure out the payout of how they value the case. But when it comes to providing the present value cost, it's not as easy. But it's very simple for us because we use an annuity to determine what these present value costs are. So for example, let's say an injured worker's indemnity cost was going to be, $290 a week for the next 12 years, and then there's going to be a life pension of $230 a week for the rest of their life. What we do is we can go to the annuity company, and these companies are the major life companies you've all heard of, MetLife, New York Life, Prudential, and we go to them and say, MetLife, for example, what would it cost for you to provide, $230 a week for the rest of this injured worker's life? And they give us the present value cost. And it's actually much more accurate than what a claims examiner or the attorneys can come up with, because the variables that they have to work into it are just that, unknown. For example, what's the life expectancy of an injured worker? So they would have to determine, well, it might be 16 years or maybe 19 years. But when we're dealing with an annuity company, we give them the date of birth. We obtain the rated age from the annuity company, and then we tell them we want $290 a week for the rest of this person's life, and they provide the cost based. They provide the cost, and it will be over the actual person's lifetime. Whether, for example, maybe they're 65 years old and they have a life expectancy of 20 years. But if they live beyond that, let's say they live 25 years, the annuity company will be paying that annuity, that monthly benefit, for the rest of that person's life, even if it's longer than the life expectancy. So it becomes very accurate and very beneficial when negotiating settlements that we can provide this actual present value, as opposed to a guesstimated present value based on how long a person might live.
And
Awesome.
Greg, just to follow up with that, I know you mentioned the rated age. So with the rated age, certain individuals have comorbid conditions. It might be high blood pressure. Maybe they had a prior heart attack. That's where we get into the diminished life expectancy. That is, a person may be 50 years old with a 30-year life expectancy. However, with comorbid conditions, that diminished life expectancy might only be 20 years versus 30 years. So I just wanted to call that out for the audience there. So thank you.
Yeah, that's very accurate, and it's one of the things that helps make a settlement more possible, because when you're dealing with rated age, instead of the person, just as you mentioned, instead of using the person's actual life, we're using a diminished life expectancy, and that comes from the annuity company. So when they're looking to pay somebody's indemnity costs, for example, over their lifetime, the cost of that annuity will be less if that person has a rated age due to comorbidities, as you mentioned.
Thank you.
Greg, can you share with us, kind of communication with the defense side broker, or identifying any other opportunities to work through any barriers in a settlement, what that looks like, and how you kind of help to educate everyone and overcome those barriers?
Yeah, that's really key with what structured settlement brokers do. On many work comp cases where we're trying to settle, there are structured settlement brokers on each side of the case, one on the defense side, one on the applicant's or claimant side. And that's especially true in the larger settlements. So, sometimes, the attorneys on each side, may come to loggerheads in any particular case, and settlement negotiations grind to a halt. Well, the advantage of having structured settlement brokers working with you, we can help identify what those issues might be and how to get around them. For example, I'm working on a case where we've been working on it for quite a long time. And a couple weeks ago, the defense attorney and applicant attorney had a conference call with just the two of them on it. So a week went by, and I called in this case, I was working on the applicant side. So I called my client, who's the applicant attorney, and said, so what progress has been made? What are we doing? And she said, well, I'm just waiting to hear back from the defense attorney, who was going to confirm that they got the authority we need to settle this case before I present the offer to my client, the applicant. I said, okay. So then I called the defense structure broker and said, nothing's going on for a while. Here's what's your take on what's going on? And the defense broker told me, well, the defense attorney, when they had that call, told the applicant attorney that he had authority, and we're just waiting to hear back the response from the injured worker on their response to the offer. And I go, okay, we have a problem, because my client was waiting to hear from the defense attorney, and now you're telling me the defense attorney was waiting to hear from the applicant attorney. So we just had a miscommunication that probably would have gone on for another 3 or 4 weeks if I hadn't spoken to the defense broker to get things cleared up and getting the settlement back on track. So that's one of the ways that we can work to always help make sure things are moving forward.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you're able to bridge that gap there for them, for sure, and bring everyone together. I'm sure the applicant, is happy too, because they probably want to get the settlement going and moving forward as well as everyone else does.
Oh, absolutely.
And speaking of the applicant and Medicare set-asides, and, obviously during our day jobs, especially at Amitros with professional administration and what you're doing with structured settlements, obviously we know a lot about Medicare set-asides, but how do you help explain to the applicant what a Medicare set-aside is? And then how do you also help advocate for them, during that process? Because it is a lot of information coming at someone.
Yeah. And first, when I'm talking to an applicant, when I happen to be on the applicant side on a case, many times we have new applicant attorneys, or ones that are not so experienced in working with Medicare set-asides. And, they want some help on how to explain this to the injured worker. well, I'm always available to get on a conference call with the applicant attorney and the applicant to help go over and explain the Medicare set aside. And this is all also when I'm talking to applicant attorneys, how I recommend they should explain the Medicare set aside. Instead of citing the statute and being very legalistic about it, I found out that the applicant better understands it when you sort of tell it to them as a story about what the Medicare set aside is, how it came to be, and because it's such a complicated issue that they've never had to deal with. I mean, they've never dealt with work comp typically before in their life, and then these components of it, especially the Medicare set aside, can get very confusing. So I like to explain the Medicare set aside to the injured worker, first, where did it come from? Why is it? And, I explain that, when Congress first passed Medicare in 1965, they listed workers' compensation as one of the payers that had to pay primary to Medicare. And so, what does that actually mean? It means that before the injured worker can get benefits from Medicare to pay for their medical expenses related to the work injury, the injured worker actually has to use the money from their work comp settlement first before Medicare will step in and pay future medical expenses. I explained it to them as Medicare really wanted to prevent double dipping, a situation where you had an injured worker who was on Medicare, but then settled their workers' compensation case. Medicare wanted to make sure that the injured worker spent that money from the work comp settlement for the future medical expenses before Medicare stepped in. And then, I point out that many years went by, so from 1965 to 2001, where Medicare pretty much didn't follow through on this issue. And then in 2001, they came up with the Medicare set aside arrangement, and for the first time wanted this Medicare set aside to be part of the work comp settlement. So really formalize the amount of the future medical expenses that had to be spent before the injured worker could get any Medicare benefits. And, they seem to grab onto that, especially, the idea of the double dipping. Everybody understands that. And so I explained to them that this is real now. The MSA has to be included in an MSA under certain circumstances, particularly when the injured worker is a Medicare beneficiary or soon to be one. And then advocating for the injured worker, in addition to the Medicare set aside, there are other expenses that are not covered by Medicare. And then when we're looking to settle a claim, you have to look at future medical as really being two components. One is the Medicare set aside, which Medicare, which deals with Medicare covered expenses. And then there's the non-Medicare components. There's things like, home health care and over-the-counter prescription medications and home improvements and deductibles and copays for Medicare. And these are all things that Medicare doesn't cover. So when the applicant is considering the value of their case in terms of future medical, we provide them with a present value expense of these non-Medicare medical expenses so that when they're looking at potential settlement, they make sure that the Medicare covered and the non-Medicare covered are part of the deal to make sure the injured worker is fully covered.
Yeah, I think that's so important too, especially, when Medicare's guidance is that those monies shouldn't be commingled either, and professional administration can help you manage the Medicare set aside as well as the non-Medicare monies. So I do think that's such an important factor and something that should be spoken with the applicant to make sure that they're taken care of as the whole person. And switching gears a little bit, when you think about claims examiners, adjusters, maybe they're new to the industry, maybe that's their first time, starting to negotiate a case and things like that. What are some tips or tricks or things you wish, the defense side thought about more, or that you try to make sure that you're educating to help kind of all parties reach the settlement, as you said before?
Oh, that's a great question. When I'm dealing on the defense side and working with the claims adjusters, it's really important to talk about the different funding options for the Medicare set-asides. CMS, gives us really two options on how to fund the Medicare set-aside. One is the lump sum, and the second is structuring the MSA, which means providing an upfront amount, which CMS calls the seed money, and then annual payments for a set number of years. And, I explain that Medicare allows both a lump sum funding and a structured MSA payment, because in the end, when you add up the annual payments plus the seed money, it totals the amount of the lump sum. And it's really beneficial to the claims examiner, and especially when a claims examiner is dealing with an injured worker that is not represented by an attorney. Because, obviously, if they have an attorney, the applicant's attorney can explain all this to them. But there's a lot of cases where the adjuster is dealing directly with an unrepresented claimant. And it's, I go over with the adjuster how an offer that might not originally be attractive to the injured worker can become attractive if the MSA is structured. For example, let's say the examiner has $100,000 of authority and they have a $90,000 Medicare set aside. To keep things, real simplistic, if the offer was, well, we'll give the injured worker the lump sum MSA $90,000, that will leave $10,000 to give for them to have cash up front in this CNR, this settlement. And that might not be that attractive to the injured worker. But I say, if we, instead of the lump sum MSA, if we can structure the Medicare set aside with the seed amount and annual payments, that $90,000 Medicare set aside might only cost $50,000. So then in this case, with the same $100,000 settlement, the injured worker would receive $50,000 cash up front and still have the MSA. Or what claim examiners really like, we could look at reducing the offer and give maybe having an offer of $75,000 and still giving the injured worker $25,000 cash up front and still covering the MSA. So there's a whole range of options that go into that are beneficial on the defense side that I go into when I'm talking with claims examiners.
Yeah, and it's so cool how structure can really help just bring such a creative approach to the constraints of authority, as you just mentioned. And then, thank you for bringing up the unrepresented injured worker too, because I think, as to your point, there's such a population of those folks out there that, do need the education. They don't necessarily have an applicant attorney there with them, but they probably have a really strong adjuster that's helping them through the process, and they can obviously lean on you to help as well. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and I've come across many, great claims examiners, that really care to make sure that the injured workers, understand what's going on and get the best possible settlement, because they understand these people are in a situation they wish they were not in, and they have real empathy for what's going on. And one of the other benefits that I stress when I'm talking to the injured worker, and also when on the other side when you're dealing with the applicant's attorney, is really both parties strive to explain the benefits to the injured worker of getting out of the work comp system, especially on the medical side of things, because as we've all seen that work comps cases can go on for years and years. It's not unusual to have a 5-year-old case or even a 10-year-old case. And so the injured worker has now been in this work comp system, especially on the medical side, for a number of years, and has probably gotten really frustrated with it, mostly because they can't choose their own doctor in most cases, or if a procedure needs to be done, it can be vetoed by a doctor that they've never met before. And it just seems really strange, and something that they're usually fed up and want to get out of. And so we're talking when we can see an ARA case or get a settlement that allow them to get out of the system, where they can then find their own doctors and no longer need prior approval to get procedures done. It really motivates the injured worker to arrive at a settlement.
Yep. Greg, to your point, not all injured workers applicants enjoy going to, independent medical examinations or agreed upon medical evaluations. There's also challenges too with prescriptions and having, a drug utilization review. So, having to go to IMEs and having to, get pre-approval for surgeries and all that tends to be challenging. Whereas, on the other side of this, where they settle out, you're not going through that process. I have just a couple questions. You talked about the structured settlements versus lump sum. Is there a dollar threshold that you would recommend for an MSA when you would structure versus providing those monies in a lump sum, or is it more of a case by case?
Well, probably, most of the life companies have a minimum limit when what they are willing to structure, because if structure is just too small, it doesn't make financial sense for a MetLife or a New York Life or a Pac Life to want to structure the case. Now I'm talking about a case that, let's say, the only thing that's being structured is the MSA. So probably a $20,000 or $25,000 Medicare set aside would probably be on the lower end of what you would want to structure. But I've had small cases where anytime you structure an MSA, it is going to provide more cash up front to the injured worker. So, I have a couple of attorneys that really like to structure even the smallest MSA, because even if it'll bring an additional $1,000 or $2,000 in cash to the injured worker, that just might be enough to get them to settle the case. So, yeah, so a rule of thumb, 20, 25,000 is on the small side, but there are a couple of life companies that will structure an MSA even below those ranks. But those are the special cases when money is really tight, and it would only make sense if we can squeeze out that extra $1,000 or $2,000 cash up front to make the case work.
Well, thank you. So CMS has a consent form that would be signed by the applicant. And within that consent form, there's an obligation to explain the MSA, explain the submission process. And of course, my favorite subject would be professional administration. Do you see the claims examiners and the applicant's attorneys properly explaining, all three of those areas?
Well, probably not as well as they should. And that's probably more a as a result of this recent consent form. I think it's been out just 3 or 4 years now, where CMS is really trying to get the parties involved in making sure the injured worker really understand what's going on. So you had, for 20 years since 2001, this really wasn't the case. And most, attorneys and claims examiners did not go into a lot of detail about what the Medicare set aside encompassed, making sure the injured worker understood the difference between self-administration and professional administration. And so it's sort of been a slow learning curve for the parties now to make sure that they are going into that detail. Just since I've been around with the MSAs for more than 20 years, just a brief history of the professional administration. When I first got into it, Medicare, even back then said the MSA could be structured, or it could be a lump sum, and it could be self-administered or professionally administered. And it wasn't until I think a couple of memos later that then CMS said, oh, and by the way, if you go professional administration, the cost of that cannot come out of the MSA. So there were just a couple of MSA professional administration companies back then. And while everybody saw the benefit of professional administration, the cost of it 20 years ago was outrageous. And I actually had cases where the professional administrators would cost an annual fee. And in certain cases, the annual fee of professional administration was higher than the MSA itself. So obviously back then, it was, 5% maybe would take professional administration in the highest dollar cases, and 95% would self-administer. But now since then, we've seen a complete reversal in that. And I would say, well, I would recommend, 95% of the time you go professional administration and not self-administration. And the ones that wouldn't would probably be the smallest MSAs that might not need it.
Right. So, Greg, in terms of professional administration, certainly with the administration piece, there's complexities to it, right? I mean, you have a separate interest-bearing account. You need to notify your medical provider that you've settled out the case. You have to follow the state fee schedule. You have to account for, all of the medical payments. There's a lot to it. And my question is, when do you recommend professional administration to your clients?
Oh, now I recommend professional administration on almost all the cases. And, the number one driver is it has become so much more sophisticated what the professional administrators can do now. And the cost has diminished or gone away in a lot of cases. I actually became involved with Amitros years ago, soon after they started, because one of my larger clients, Albertsons, was one of the first companies that decided they would actually pay for professional administration, so that it was not a cost to the injured worker. So almost every case that we settled with Albertsons, it was paid for. So there was no cost to the injured worker. And then to get to the details of your question, yes, with the complexity of what CMS is requiring from the Medicare set aside, the separate bank account, the accounting, making sure that the costs are properly paid out and that only the costs that Medicare would otherwise pay get so complicated that going with professional administration, first of all, it's going to reduce a lot of mistakes. You have the professional administrator who's taking on that burden of making sure that any bills from the provider are properly paid out of the MSA if it relates to the case. Secondly, it's going to reduce so much stress on the injured worker not to have to worry about that, because you can imagine an injured worker gets a bill. Well, was this related to my back injury from that, when I fell on the job, or was this related when I tripped over a curb that had nothing to do to work, and which should I pay it out of? And then finally, it eliminates the paperwork. And what I haven't even mentioned is the benefit to the injured worker that Amitros negotiates fees with these providers and with the drug companies that are lower than the injured worker can get on their own if they're self-administering. And the benefit to that is the Medicare set-aside is going to last longer. And it's the goal, it's my goal whenever I'm looking at a Medicare set-aside. We never want the Medicare set-aside to run out of money. And Amitros really goes a long way in making sure that those dollars are going to last as long as possible.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And certainly if I was an injured worker with an MSA, the question is, would I self-administer? I probably could. I might have troubles finding where the state fee schedule is, but I would choose not to. It's something that's a lifetime that you're responsible for, along with the annual reporting. So appreciate your response. In terms of preservation of benefits and coordinating with the whether it's the applicant's attorney or the claims examiner, how do you see Amitros as a resource to help collaborate and get the case resolved?
Oh, they're so beneficial. I mean, I kind of miss these days, but the pre-COVID days, we would have informal settlement conferences all the times where you'd get the defense attorney, applicant attorney, both structured brokers, and then in would walk Tracy or one of the Amitros representatives who was key to explaining to the injured worker, who obviously was also at the meeting, how professional administration works and the benefit of it. So now, post-COVID, a lot of these meetings happen online, which is not quite as nice, but it still gets the job done. And the Amitros representative always makes themselves available because they do the best job explaining the benefits of professional administration. And then even now that we're getting professional administration is so normal now that most of the parties believe that they can explain it to the injured worker themselves, and in that case just contacting Amitros online, requesting the contract, and then it comes right out to us. then it's available for us to include in the CNR. So whether it's the one-on-one experience with the actual person, or on the tech side, getting it sent straight from your home office, you guys really make it easy, so that this part of it is not any type of barrier to settlement, and makes things flow real smoothly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Greg. Andrew, do you have some additional questions?
Yeah, Greg, I just had one more question for you as we kind of bring the episode to a close. If you can think, what are the three kind of biggest takeaways, or the most important things that you would want to share, or have, an applicant, if they're listening to this, or a future client of yours, if they're going to listen to this, what are three really important things you would want them to know, about structures, professional administration, Medicare set-asides, really just kind of what you wake up and say, like, gosh, these are the most important things for people to know.
Yeah, that's great. I would say, first of all, making sure that the injured worker has a clear understanding of the present value of their case, whether it's the indemnity and the future medical. Because, and this goes for the adjusters as well, they can easily calculate out the payout of a case. But when you're trying to negotiate the settlement today, the payout really doesn't matter as much. It's what the cost of that payout will be. So, number one would be that it's really important that the present value of the indemnity and future medical costs, so that when you're negotiating, both sides are talking apples to apples, not one's talking payout while the other one's talking present value costs. So that's really important for the injured worker to understand. Secondly, it's really important for the injured worker to understand, what the Medicare set-aside is, and that it is here to stay, and it is serious, because, over the last 20 years, we've all gotten questions from injured workers, in particularly, saying, well, yes, I'm going to settle my case, and I think I want to, self-administer that Medicare set-aside, because, I've been eyeing this great boat, and I just want to take that Medicare set-aside money and buy this boat I've been eyeing. And we really got to explain to the injured worker that that's not what the Medicare set-aside is for. And, it is a danger if you have a large Medicare set-aside, and the injured worker is going to self-administer that, that the money is, properly used. And when you explain to them, you cannot do that, because it will come back to bite you down the line. If you misuse the funds in your Medicare set-aside, you are potentially looking at losing your Medicare for future needed procedures down the line. Because if you take money out of the Medicare set-aside account, use it for something that's not approved, then in the future, when you might need a surgery, Medicare is going to say, okay, we'll pay for that surgery, but just show us the receipts that you properly used your MSA funds. And if you turn in a receipt that has a boat on it, Medicare is not going to pay for that surgery. So, so again, when I'm talking on the applicant side and talking with the applicant attorney, it's another great benefit why professional administration makes sense, because it will prevent the injured worker from hurting themselves. If the money's in a professional administered account, it can't be misused. And I guess that leads to the third question, that why professional administration is so important, because that's the one thing we didn't talk about before, that it'll prevent the injured worker from doing something that they shouldn't. And while I remember back in 2003, 2004, we'd get together at a conference and we say, "Hey, have you ever heard of Medicare or CMS actually denying an injured worker a procedure?" And back 18, 19 years ago, we go, "No, is this a joke? Does CMS take this seriously?" Because back then, we'd never heard of it. But these days, we certainly know from the report that you did that Medicare does, and for the last several years, will actually prevent an injured worker from having Medicare pay for a procedure or something necessary if the MSA was not accurately used and the money in it was used only for medical expenses related to the work injury. So now it's a reality where 20 years ago it wasn't. So again, tying in to the injured worker, they have to use that money the right way, and having it set aside in an account where they can't just go to the bank and spend the money in a wasteful way, but using a professional administrator will really protect them from themselves.
Well, Gregg, thank you so much. You're such a wealth of knowledge in this space and regarding Medicare and structures. We really appreciate your time today. And how can folks get a hold of you if they have any questions?
Well, they can reach me at email at greggchap@aol.com, GREGGCHAP @aol.com, or call us in the office at 800-845-2969. Really appreciated speaking with you guys today. This is such an important topic, and I hope people will get out of it something that's really key to settling these work comp cases.
Awesome. Thanks, Gregg.
Thank you, Gregg.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to It's Settled, the Ametros podcast. Find us on major streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review means a lot to us. It helps us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. For more information about Ametros, please visit our website at ametros.com. That's AMETROS.com.
And a big shout out to our amazing guests for sharing their experiences, and to our dedicated podcast producer, Melanie Samran. Join us in our next episode for more uplifting stories. It's settled. On to the next time. Stay inspired and continue making positive impact.